The gunshot shattered the midnight stillness like glass breaking against stone, and Teresa Bradford's heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity as she watched a man crumple to the dusty ground behind the Dorado saloon. She had been walking home late from tending to Mrs. Henderson's fever when she saw it happen, saw the flash of gunpowder in the darkness, saw the three men standing over the body with their weapons drawn. The year was 1878, and El Dorado, Kansas was supposed to be a civilized town now, with the railroad bringing progress and prosperity. But Teresa knew in that moment that some things never changed, that evil still lurked in the shadows waiting to strike. She pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the building adjacent to the alley, her medical bag clutched to her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from what she had witnessed. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she forced herself to remain absolutely still, praying that the darkness would conceal her presence. The three men were speaking in low voices now, their faces partially illuminated by the oil lamp that hung outside the saloon's back door. She recognized them instantly. Marshal Dalton Hayes stood in the center, his silver badge catching the lamplight. Beside him were his two deputies, men she had seen strutting around town with an air of authority that now seemed sinister and corrupt. "Get him loaded up," Hayes said, his voice cold and businesslike. "We'll dump him in the ravine past Miller's Creek. Nobody will find him for weeks, if ever." Teresa felt bile rise in her throat. The man they had killed lay motionless in the dirt, and she could see even from her hiding place that he was well dressed, probably a businessman or someone important. This was not some drunken brawl gone wrong. This was calculated, deliberate murder, and the very men sworn to uphold the law were the ones who had committed it. She needed to move, needed to get away before they discovered her, but her legs felt like lead weights. Just as she began to edge backward into the deeper shadows, her foot caught on something, a loose board or perhaps a discarded bottle, and the sound rang out like a church bell in the quiet night. What was that? One of the deputies hissed. Teresa did not wait to hear more. She gathered her skirts and ran, her boots pounding against the hard, packed earth as she fled down the narrow space between buildings. Behind her, she heard shouting, heard the sound of pursuit, and terror gave her speed she did not know she possessed. She emerged onto Main Street and looked wildly around for somewhere to hide, somewhere safe. But at this hour, everything was closed and shuttered. Her small house on the edge of town seemed impossibly far away, and she knew she would never make it there before they caught her. A strong hand suddenly grabbed her arm and yanked her sideways into another alley. She opened her mouth to scream, but another hand clamped over it, and a deep voice whispered urgently in her ear, "Do not make a sound if you want to live." She was pulled backward into what appeared to be a stable, the familiar smell of horses and hay filling her nostrils. The man holding her moved with practiced silence, guiding her past several stalls to a ladder that led up to a hayloft. He released her only to gesture upward, and something in his eyes made her obey without question. She climbed as quietly as she could, her skirts hampering her movement, and he followed close behind. In the loft, he pulled hay bales around them, creating a makeshift hiding place just as she heard voices entering the stable below. Teresa's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give them away. The stranger beside her remained perfectly still, and she could feel the tension radiating from his body as the marshal and his men searched below. "She came this way, I know she did," one of the deputies said. "Check every stall," Hayes ordered. "We cannot let her get away. She saw everything." Teresa closed her eyes and prayed silently, feeling the warmth of the stranger next to her, grateful for his presence even though she had no idea who he was or why he had helped her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the men searched below. Finally, she heard Hayes curse. She must have kept running. Fan out and check the residential streets. Check her house. I want her found before sunrise. The footsteps retreated, and still Teresa and her rescuer did not move. They waited in silence as the night deepened around them, neither willing to risk discovery by speaking or shifting position. Teresa's muscles ached from holding herself so rigidly still, and her mind raced with the horror of what she had witnessed. That poor man, shot down in cold blood by the very people meant to protect citizens. And now they wanted her dead too, wanted to silence the only witness to their crime. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour, the stranger stirred. "They will be watching your house," he said quietly. "You cannot go back there." Teresa turned to look at him properly for the first time. Even in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, she could see he was perhaps 25 or 26 years old, with strong features and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore the clothing of a working cowboy, durable and practical, and there was a capable air about him that made her feel marginally safer. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Name is Parker Reynolds," he said. "I work at the Double R Ranch outside town. Was bringing in some horses for shoeing when I saw you running like the devil himself was after you. Figured you needed help." "They killed a man," Teresa said, and her voice broke despite her efforts to control it. "Marshal Hayes and his deputies murdered someone in cold blood, and now they want to kill me because I witnessed it." Parker's jaw tightened. "Hayes is dirty. Plenty of folks suspected it, but nobody had proof. He has the town council in his pocket, probably the judge too. What am I going to do?" Teresa asked, feeling despair wash over her. "I cannot hide forever. They will find me eventually." "Not if we get you out of town," Parker said. He studied her face in the darkness, and she saw determination in his eyes. "I can take you somewhere safe, somewhere beyond Hayes's reach. But we need to leave now before dawn. Once the sun is up, it will be too dangerous." Teresa wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could not just abandon her life here, her work as the town's only trained nurse, the patients who depended on her. But she knew he was right. If she stayed, she would be dead within a day. Hayes would manufacture some story to explain her disappearance, and no one would ever know the truth. "Where would we go?" she asked. "I have a cousin who runs a cattle operation up near Abilene," Parker said. "It is a 3-day ride from here, maybe 4 if we take the less traveled routes to avoid being followed. He is a good man, and he has no love for corrupt lawmen. He will help us figure out what to do next." Teresa nodded slowly. She had no other choice, no other option that did not end with her blood soaking into the Kansas soil. "I need supplies from my house, medical supplies, clothing, money." "Too dangerous," Parker said. "They will definitely have someone watching it." "I know how to get in without being seen," Teresa insisted. "There is a root cellar with an entrance at the back, hidden by the vegetable garden. I can slip in through there and be out again in 5 minutes." Parker looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him she would not be swayed. "All right," he said finally. "But I am coming with you, and if I say we run, we run. Understood?" "Understood." They climbed down from the loft carefully, Parker checking to make sure the stable was truly empty before allowing Teresa to descend. He led her to a magnificent bay horse in one of the stalls, a powerful animal that stood at least 16 hands high. "This is Ranger," he said, stroking the horse's nose. "He is the fastest horse at the Double R and the smartest. I was planning to ride him back to the ranch tomorrow, but it looks like we are leaving tonight instead." He saddled the horse with efficient movements, and Teresa watched, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Everything was happening so fast. Just hours ago, her biggest concern had been whether Mrs. Henderson's fever would break. Now she was fleeing for her life with a stranger, about to become a fugitive from the very people who should have been protecting her. They moved through the dark streets like ghosts, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares. Teresa's house sat on the northeastern edge of town, a modest structure she had inherited from her late father, who had been the town doctor before her. She had trained under him for years before his death from pneumonia the previous winter, and the townspeople had gradually come to accept a woman in a healing role, though some still looked askance at her unmarried state at 23 years old. As they approached, Parker held up a hand, signaling her to wait. He crept forward, his movements silent and sure, and disappeared around the side of the house. Teresa held her breath, straining her ears for any sound of trouble. After what felt like an eternity, he reappeared and gestured for her to follow. "There is a deputy sitting on your front porch," he whispered. "Looks half asleep, but he is definitely there. Show me this root cellar." Teresa led him around to the back of the house where her small garden grew. Even in the darkness, her hands found the wooden door set into the ground, hidden among the squash vines. She pulled it open carefully, wincing at the slight creak of hinges, and peered down into the blackness below. "I will need light," she whispered. Parker produced a match and a small lantern from somewhere, shielding the flame as he lit it. The warm glow illuminated the earthen stairs leading down. "Make it quick," he said. Teresa descended into the cool darkness of the cellar, her medical training keeping her focused despite her fear. She moved through the cellar to the interior door that led up into her kitchen, opening it slowly and listening for any sound from above. The deputy on the porch was outside at the front, and she prayed he would stay there. She climbed the interior stairs and emerged into her familiar kitchen. In the darkness, she navigated by memory, grabbing her leather medical bag and filling it with supplies. Bandages, laudanum, whiskey for disinfecting, her surgical tools, herbs for various ailments. She moved to her bedroom and changed quickly out of her blood-stained dress into more practical traveling clothes, sturdy brown wool that would hold up better to hard riding. She stuffed 2 more changes of clothing into a canvas satchel along with her mother's silver hairbrush, the only thing of value she owned besides her medical instruments. From the loose floorboard beneath her bed, she retrieved the small leather pouch containing her savings, nearly $200 in paper money and gold coins. A floorboard creaked on the front porch, and Teresa froze. Heavy footsteps moved across the wooden planks, and she heard the deputy curse. "Damn cold night," he muttered to himself. Teresa did not wait to hear more. She hurried back through the kitchen and down the cellar stairs, pulling the door shut behind her as quietly as possible. Parker was waiting at the bottom of the exterior stairs, his face tense with worry that eased slightly when he saw her. "Got everything?" he whispered. She nodded, and they climbed out of the root cellar into the garden. Teresa pulled the door closed and scattered some vine leaves over it, making it less obvious. They crept back the way they had come, moving from shadow to shadow until they reached the stable where Ranger waited patiently. "Can you ride?" Parker asked as he secured her bags to the saddle. "Well enough," Teresa said. "My father taught me when I was a girl." "We will be riding double until we can get you a horse of your own," Parker said. He swung up into the saddle with easy grace and extended a hand to her. Teresa grasped it and let him pull her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's broad back, very aware of how close she was to this man she barely knew, how she had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist and trust him completely. Parker guided Ranger out of the stable and into the street, keeping the horse to a walk despite what must have been his desire to flee at a gallop. They moved through the sleeping town, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made Teresa's heart jump. But they encountered no one, and within 15 minutes, they had left the buildings behind and were heading north on the open prairie road. Only then did Parker urge Ranger into a canter, and the powerful horse stretched out beneath them, eating up the distance with long, smooth strides. Teresa clung to Parker's waist, her face pressed against his back, feeling the wind whip past them as they rode into the darkness. Behind them, El Dorado disappeared, and with it, the only life she had ever known. They rode for hours, stopping only once to let Ranger drink from a creek and rest for a few minutes. Parker seemed to know every trail and back road, guiding them north and slightly west, away from the main routes where Hayes and his men might search. The sky began to lighten gradually, the deep black fading to indigo and then to the soft purple of pre-dawn. "We need to find a place to hole up for the day," Parker said, the first words he had spoken since they left town. "Hayes will have men out searching by now, and we are too visible in daylight." "How far have we come?" Teresa asked. Her legs ached from gripping the horse and every muscle in her body protested the unfamiliar exertion. "Maybe 20 miles, Parker said. "There is an abandoned homestead about 5 miles ahead. Folks tried to farm it a few years back but gave up after the drought of '76. Should still have a standing structure we can shelter in." The homestead, when they reached it, was more dilapidated than Parker had suggested. But the main cabin still had most of its roof intact, and the small barn offered shelter for Ranger. Parker helped Teresa dismount, and she nearly fell when her feet touched the ground, her legs refusing to cooperate after so many hours of riding. "Easy," Parker said, steadying her with his hands on her waist. "You did well for someone not used to long rides." "I feel like I shall never walk properly again," Teresa admitted, trying to work some feeling back into her cramped legs. Parker smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his serious face into something unexpectedly handsome. "You will get used to it. We have a lot more riding ahead of us." He unsaddled Ranger and rubbed the horse down carefully, checking his hooves and making sure he had access to the small amount of water in the rusty trough. Teresa explored the cabin, finding it mostly empty except for a broken chair and some ancient straw mattress stuffing that mice had made into nests. Dust covered everything, and daylight streamed through gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen out. "It is not much, but it will keep us hidden," Parker said, coming up behind her. "We should try to sleep. I want to travel mostly at night until we are farther from El Dorado." Teresa nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The terror of the night, combined with the physical exertion of the ride, had drained her completely. She sank down onto the floor in the corner, using her satchel as a pillow, and Parker settled near the door, his rifle across his lap. "You should sleep," Teresa said. "You have been awake as long as I have, and you did all the riding." "I will sleep in shifts," Parker said. "Someone needs to keep watch in case Hayes's men come this way. Then wake me in a few hours and I will take a turn," Teresa insisted. "I may not be able to shoot, but I can certainly stay awake and alert you if anyone approaches." Parker looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. "A few hours, then." Despite her exhaustion, sleep did not come easily. Teresa lay on the hard floor, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the night over and over. The gunshot, the falling body, the marshal's cold voice ordering his men to dispose of the corpse. She wondered who the murdered man had been, whether he had a family somewhere waiting for him to come home. She wondered if anyone would even look for him, or if Hayes would simply declare him missing and move on, his crime hidden forever. Except it would not be hidden, because she had seen it. She was the witness, the one person who could bring Hayes to justice. But how? Who would believe her word against a marshal? And even if she could convince someone, how would she survive long enough to testify? These thoughts circled in her mind like vultures until finally, mercifully, exhaustion won, and she drifted into uneasy sleep. She woke to find the sun high overhead, bright light streaming through the gaps in the walls. Parker was still at his post by the door, though his eyes were heavy and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. Teresa sat up, working the kinks out of her neck. "You did not wake me," she said accusingly. "You needed the rest," Parker said simply. "Besides, I have pulled plenty of all-night watches during cattle drives. I am used to it." "That does not mean you do not need sleep," Teresa said. She stood and went to her medical bag, pulling out a small cloth packet. "Here, chew on this. It is willow bark. It will help with the fatigue." Parker accepted it with a grateful nod. "You take your doctoring seriously." "Nursing," Teresa corrected. "Women cannot be doctors, at least not officially, but I trained under my father for 8 years and I know as much as most physicians." "Your father must have been a progressive man," Parker observed. "He was a practical man," Teresa said. "He had no sons and he needed help with his practice. When he saw that I had the aptitude and the interest, he taught me everything he knew." The town gossips thought it was scandalous, a young woman seeing patients and tending to injuries, but my father did not care. He said healing was too important to be limited by people's prejudices. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Teresa felt the familiar ache of grief. Her father had been gone only 10 months, and the wound was still raw. "I miss him every day." They fell into comfortable silence, and Teresa rummaged through her bags to see what she had grabbed in her hasty packing. 2 dresses, her nightgown, some undergarments, stockings. Not much to start a new life with, but it would have to do. She found a hunk of bread wrapped in cloth that she must have unconsciously grabbed from her kitchen, now somewhat stale but still edible. She broke it in half and offered part to Parker. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "Yesterday afternoon," Parker admitted, accepting the bread. "Thank you." They ate in silence, washing the dry bread down with water from Parker's canteen. It was not much of a meal, but it took the edge off Teresa's hunger. She studied Parker's face in the daylight, noting the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors, the strong jaw and straight nose, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard physical labor. He was a good-looking man, she realized, though worry and exhaustion currently masked it. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "You did not know me. You could have just ridden past and left me to my fate." Parker was quiet for a long moment, staring out the gap in the door at the prairie beyond. "My younger sister was killed 3 years ago," he said finally, his voice rough. "She was traveling with our parents from Texas to Colorado when their wagon was attacked by bandits. My parents and my sister Sarah were all murdered. The local sheriff barely investigated, said there was nothing to be done, that the bandits had probably moved on to another territory." "I am so sorry," Teresa said softly. "I found out later that the sheriff was taking bribes to look the other way when certain criminal elements operated in his jurisdiction," Parker continued. "Those bandits had killed before, and they killed again after my family. If that sheriff had done his job, my sister would still be alive. So when I saw you running from a corrupt lawman, I could not just stand by. I could not let another innocent person die because men with badges betrayed their oaths." Teresa felt tears sting her eyes. "Your sister was fortunate to have a brother who cared so much." "I failed her by not being there," Parker said. "I was working a cattle drive in Montana when it happened. By the time I got word and traveled to Colorado, they were already buried. I never even got to say goodbye." "You cannot blame yourself for that," Teresa said firmly. You could not have known what would happen. Maybe not, but I can make sure I do not fail someone else who needs help. He looked at her directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. I will keep you safe, Teresa. I give you my word. We will find a way to bring Hayes to justice and make sure that man's death is not forgotten. You do not even know who I am, Teresa protested. I could be anyone. Why stake your life on protecting me? Because you were brave enough to run instead of pretending you saw nothing, Parker said. Because you are clearly a healer who cares about helping people. Because you remind me of my sister, who was also fearless and determined. He paused, then added more softly, and because I can see in your eyes that you are a good person, and good people are worth protecting. Teresa felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but something more as well. Something that made her very aware of how close they were sitting, how his eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. Thank you, she said quietly. For believing in me, for risking yourself for a stranger. We are not strangers anymore, Parker said with a slight smile. I figure once you have ridden 20 miles through the night pressed up against someone's back, you have moved past the stranger stage. Despite everything, Teresa found herself smiling back. I suppose that is true. Now you really should try to get some more sleep, Parker said. I will wake you this afternoon, and then I will rest before we ride again tonight. This time Teresa did not argue. She returned to her corner and lay down, and perhaps because she felt safer knowing Parker was watching over her, or perhaps because her body simply demanded it, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost immediately. When she woke again, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Parker was asleep near the door, his chest rising and falling steadily, his face relaxed in a way it had not been while awake. Teresa rose quietly and crept outside to attend to necessities, then checked on Ranger in the barn. The horse nickered softly when he saw her, and she stroked his velvety nose. You are a good boy, are you not? She murmured. Thank you for carrying us to safety. She found some reasonably fresh grass growing near the barn and gathered armfuls of it for Ranger to eat, supplementing the meager grazing available in the homestead's overgrown yard. As she worked, she thought about the days ahead. 3 or 4 days of riding to reach Abilene, Parker had said. That meant 3 or 4 more nights like last night, clinging to his back as they raced across the prairie. The thought should have made her uncomfortable, she supposed, but instead she found it oddly comforting. There was something solid and dependable about Parker Reynolds, something that made her feel protected despite their desperate circumstances. She heard movement from the cabin and turned to see Parker emerging, stretching his arms over his head and working the stiffness out of his shoulders. His eyes found her immediately, and she saw relief flash across his face before he schooled his expression back to neutrality. I was beginning to think you had run off, he said, coming to join her by the barn. Where would I go? Teresa asked practically. I do not even know where we are. Fair point. Parker looked at the sky, gauging the remaining daylight. We should eat something. If you have any food left, then prepare to ride. I want to cover as much ground as possible tonight. The farther we get from El Dorado, the safer we will be. They shared the last of Teresa's bread and some dried beef that Parker had in his saddlebags. It was not much of a dinner, but it would sustain them through the night's ride. As the sun sank below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Parker saddled Ranger again and helped Teresa mount. The second night of riding was harder than the first. Teresa's muscles, already sore from the previous night, protested every movement, and she had to grit her teeth against the discomfort. But she did not complain, knowing that Parker was likely just as uncomfortable, and that he was doing everything he could to keep them safe. They traveled north and west, following cattle trails and dry creek beds, avoiding the main roads where they might encounter other travelers. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, rolling hills of grass that whispered in the wind like voices from another world. The stars overhead were brilliant, undimmed by any town lights, and Teresa found herself awed by their beauty despite her fear and exhaustion. Near midnight, they stopped at a small creek to let Ranger drink and rest. Teresa slid from the horse's back with a groan, and Parker caught her as her legs buckled. "Easy," he said, supporting her weight until she could stand on her own. "We are pushing hard, I know, but we need to put as much distance as possible between us and Hayes." "I understand," Teresa said, trying to work some feeling back into her legs. "How much farther tonight?" "Another few hours if you can manage it. There is a town called Salina about 15 miles north of here. We need to go around it, but once we are past, we should be able to find another place to shelter for the day." Teresa nodded, splashing water from the creek on her face to wake herself up. The cold shocked her system, driving away the fog of exhaustion for a moment. When she straightened, she found Parker watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" she asked. "You are tougher than you look," he said. "Most women I know would be complaining or crying by now." "Would crying help our situation?" Teresa asked dryly. "No." "Then I see no point in wasting energy on it." She paused, then added more seriously, "My father used to say that a healer cannot afford to fall apart when things get difficult. People depend on us to stay calm and focused, even in the worst circumstances. I suppose that training is serving me well now." "Your father raised a remarkable woman," Parker said softly. Teresa felt heat rise to her cheeks and was grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "We should keep moving," she said, changing the subject. They rode on through the night, circling wide around the scattered lights of Salina and continuing north into increasingly empty country. By the time the sky began to lighten again, Teresa was swaying in the saddle, barely able to keep her eyes open. Parker's voice seemed to come from very far away when he said, "There is a cave system ahead. My cousin told me about it once. We can shelter there for the day." The caves turned out to be a series of shallow overhangs carved into a rocky hillside by centuries of wind and water. Parker selected the largest one, which went back about 20 feet and was tall enough for them to stand upright. He unsaddled Ranger and brought him into the cave as well, providing additional warmth and making sure the horse would not be visible to anyone passing by. Teresa collapsed onto the sandy floor of the cave, too tired to even remove her boots. Parker spread his bedroll beside her and lay down with a tired sigh. For several minutes they simply lay there in silence, listening to each other breathe and feeling the warmth slowly return to their exhausted bodies. "Parker," Teresa said quietly, "thank you, again, for everything you are doing." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I am doing what any decent man would do." "I think we both know that is not true," Teresa said. "Most men would have looked the other way. You chose to get involved to risk your own life for mine. That means something." She heard him shift beside her, felt rather than saw him turn to look at her in the dim light filtering into the cave. "You mean something," he said simply. "I cannot explain it, Teresa. I have known you less than 2 days, but I feel like I would do anything to keep you safe. Like you matter in a way I cannot quite put into words." Teresa's heart began to beat faster. She turned her head to look at him and found his face just inches from hers, his eyes dark and intense. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us. It does not make sense, but it is real." "What are we going to do about it?" Parker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose we survive first," Teresa said, trying to keep her tone light despite the way her pulse was racing. "Then we can figure out what this is." "Deal," Parker said, and she saw him smile slightly in the dimness. "Sleep now. We both need rest." But Teresa found it hard to sleep with Parker so close, with the memory of his words echoing in her mind. Eventually, exhaustion won out over her racing thoughts, and she drifted off, dreaming of dark eyes and strong hands and a voice promising to keep her safe. The next few days fell into a pattern. They would sleep through the daylight hours, huddled together in whatever shelter they could find, then rise at dusk to ride through the night. By the third day, they risked stopping at a small ranch to buy supplies and, more importantly, a second horse for Teresa. Parker negotiated with the rancher, a grizzled old man who asked no questions and seemed content to take their money without prying into their business. The horse he sold them was a mare named Daisy, a sturdy sorrel with a sweet disposition and an easy gait. Teresa felt immediate affection for the animal and was grateful not to have to ride double anymore, even though she found herself missing the closeness with Parker. With two horses, they could cover ground more quickly and rest the animals more frequently. They pushed north, crossing into Nebraska territory and then swinging east toward Abilene. The landscape changed gradually, the rolling prairie giving way to more broken country with stands of cottonwood trees along the watercourses. They talked during their rides now, long conversations that helped pass the hours and deepen the connection growing between them. Teresa told Parker about her childhood, about growing up as the town doctor's daughter and learning to mix medicines before she learned to read. She told him about her mother, who had died when Teresa was 12, and how her father had thrown himself into his work afterward, teaching Teresa everything he knew as a way of coping with his grief. Parker, in turn, told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest of 4 children and the only son. His 3 older sisters had spoiled him terribly, he admitted with a laugh, but they had also taught him to respect women and see them as equals. He told her about learning to ride before he could walk, about driving cattle north along the Kishom Trail, about the vast open spaces that had shaped his soul. "I never wanted to be anything but a cowboy," he said as they rode side by side under a canopy of stars. "My father hoped I would take over the ranch someday, but after he and my mother and Sarah died, I could not bear to go back there. Too many memories. So I drifted north, working different ranches, never staying in one place too long." "That sounds lonely," Teresa observed. "It was," Parker admitted. I have friends but nobody close. Nobody I could really talk to or trust completely. It is easier that way, I suppose. If you do not let people in, they cannot hurt you when they leave. But they also cannot bring you joy," Teresa said gently. "You wall yourself off from the pain, but you also wall yourself off from happiness." "Is that your professional medical opinion?" Parker asked, but there was no mockery in his tone, only curiosity. "It is my personal observation," Teresa said. "I did the same thing after my father died. I threw myself into my work, kept everyone at arm's length. I told myself it was because I was busy, because the town needed me, but really I was just afraid of losing someone else I cared about. And now," Parker asked quietly, "now I think I was foolish," Teresa said. "Because loss is part of life, whether we open ourselves to it or not. That man Marshal Hayes killed, he died alone in an alley and I do not even know his name. But at least he lived. At least he presumably loved and was loved, even if it ended badly. That is better than never taking the risk at all." Parker was silent for a long moment. "You are very wise for 23, he said finally. "I am a quick learner," Teresa said with a small smile, "and recent events have given me a lot to think about." They rode on through the night. And Teresa found herself watching Parker's profile in the moonlight, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the way he sat so easily in the saddle, the competent way he handled everything from setting up camp to navigating by the stars. She was falling for him, she realized. Despite the danger and the fear and the uncertainty of their future, or perhaps because of those things, she was falling deeply and irrevocably in love with Parker Reynolds. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of rightness, as if this was always meant to happen, as if fleeing for her life and riding across the prairie with a cowboy she barely knew was somehow exactly where she was supposed to be. On the fourth night, as they crested a hill and saw the lights of Abilene spread out in the valley below, Parker drew his horse to a halt. "There it is," he said. "My cousin's ranch is about 5 miles east of town. We should reach it by midnight." Teresa felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. They had made it. They were safe, or at least safer than they had been. "What is your cousin like?" she asked. "Joshua Reynolds is a good man," Parker said. "He is about 10 years older than me, one of my father's brother's sons. He came north before the war and built his ranch from nothing. He is honest and fair, and he has connections. If anyone can help us figure out how to deal with Hayes, it is Joshua." They descended the hill and rode east, following a well-maintained road that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. Fences began to appear, marking off grazing land, and Teresa saw cattle scattered across the hills, dark shapes against the pale grass. Finally, they turned onto a long drive that led to a cluster of buildings, a substantial ranch house with a wraparound porch, a large barn, several corrals, and various outbuildings. Dogs began barking as they approached, and lamps flared to life in the house. A man emerged onto the porch carrying a rifle, and Parker called out, "Joshua, it is Parker. I need your help." The man lowered the rifle immediately and came down the steps. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hair that was graying at the temples and a weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors. "Parker, what in blazes are you doing here at this hour?" Parker dismounted and helped Teresa down from Daisy. "It is a long story, and not a good one." "Can we come inside?" Joshua's eyes went from Parker to Teresa and back again, taking in their travel-stained clothes and exhausted faces. "Of course. Come in. Margaret will want to meet your companion." They followed Joshua into the house, a warm and welcoming space filled with comfortable furniture and the smell of coffee and baking. A woman appeared from the back of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that widened when she saw them. "Parker Reynolds, as I live and breathe," she said. "And who is this pretty young lady?" "This is Teresa Bradford," Parker said. "Teresa, my cousin Joshua and his wife Margaret." "Pleased to meet you," Teresa said, suddenly very conscious of how she must look after days on the trail. "You both look dead on your feet," Margaret said practically. "Joshua, help Parker settle the horses while I get Miss Bradford cleaned up and fed. You can tell us your long story after everyone has had a chance to catch their breath." Teresa wanted to protest that they should explain the situation immediately, but exhaustion and Margaret's motherly air made her comply. She let herself be led upstairs to a comfortable guest room with a real bed and clean linens, and nearly wept with gratitude when Margaret brought hot water for washing and a clean dress that belonged to one of Joshua's daughters who was away visiting relatives. Clean and fed and dressed in fresh clothes, Teresa felt almost human again. She returned downstairs to find Parker also cleaned up, sitting at the kitchen table with Joshua and Margaret, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression made her heart skip. Feel better? He asked. Much, Teresa said, taking the seat beside him that Margaret indicated. Now then, Joshua said, his voice serious. Parker has been telling us about your troubles. Murder and corrupt marshals. This is grave business. It is, Teresa agreed. She proceeded to tell them everything she had seen that night in El Dorado, describing the murder in as much detail as she could remember. I did not recognize the victim, she concluded, but he was well dressed, like a businessman or perhaps a lawyer. Marshal Hayes seemed very determined to make sure the body disappeared. Hayes, Joshua said thoughtfully. The name is familiar. I think there was some talk about him a year or so ago, something about election irregularities, but nothing was ever proved. He is dangerous, Parker said. And he knows Teresa can identify him. We need to figure out how to handle this, how to make sure she is safe and that justice is served. The obvious solution would be to go to the federal marshals, Joshua said. A crime like this would fall under their jurisdiction, especially if local law enforcement is compromised. But would they believe me? Teresa asked. I am just one woman with no proof except my word. Your testimony is proof, Margaret said firmly, and you are not just any woman. You are a trained nurse, an educated person, someone with standing in your community. Your word should carry weight. Should is not the same as will, Teresa said quietly. No, but it is a start, Joshua said. There is a federal marshal stationed in Abilene, a man named Robert Carson. I know him slightly, have had dealings with him regarding some rustling problems last year. He is an honest man as far as I can tell. At the very least, he would listen to your story. And then what? Parker asked. Even if he believes Teresa, how do we prove Hayes is guilty? The body is probably long gone, disposed of where it will never be found. Maybe not, Joshua said slowly. You said this happened 4 or 5 days ago. That is not much time. If Hayes dumped the body in a ravine as you overheard, and if we can figure out which ravine, there might still be evidence. At the very least, if the body is found, it proves someone was murdered, even if we cannot immediately prove Hayes did it. But that would mean going back to El Dorado, Teresa said, feeling fear clutch at her heart. Hayes would kill me on sight. Not if you have federal protection, Joshua said. If Marshal Carson believes your story, he could bring in men, conduct a proper investigation. Hayes might be powerful in El Dorado, but he cannot stand against federal authority, not openly anyway. They talked long into the night, debating options and considering possibilities. Finally, Margaret put her foot down and insisted they all needed sleep before making any decisions. She showed Teresa back to the guest room, and Parker was given a room down the hall. Teresa lay in the comfortable bed, clean sheets soft against her skin, and tried to quiet her racing mind. Everything was happening so fast. Just 5 days ago, she had been living her quiet life in El Dorado, tending to patients and going about her routine. Now she was a fugitive, a witness to murder, and worst of all, hopelessly in love with a cowboy who had risked everything to save her. The next morning brought clear skies and the smell of bacon frying. Teresa dressed in the borrowed clothes and made her way downstairs to find Margaret already cooking breakfast, while Joshua and Parker talked in low voices at the table. They looked up when she entered, and both men stood politely. "Good morning," Joshua said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in days," Teresa admitted. "Thank you for your hospitality." "No need to thank us," Margaret said, setting a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. "Family helps family, and anyone Parker brings to our door is family as far as we are concerned." They ate breakfast together, the conversation carefully avoiding the topic that weighed on all their minds. Finally, when the plates were cleared and fresh coffee poured, Joshua brought it up. "I have been thinking about your situation," he said. And I believe the best course of action is for all of us to ride into Abilene today and speak with Marshal Carson. Parker and I will accompany you, Teresa, and we will present your testimony together. Two respected ranchers vouching for you should carry some weight. I agree, Parker said. The sooner we get federal authorities involved, the safer Teresa will be. Teresa nodded, trying to quell the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. All right, let us do it. They rode into Abilene that afternoon, 3 on horseback, Margaret having elected to stay at the ranch. The town was much larger than El Dorado, bustling with activity from the railroad and the cattle trade. Joshua led them to a solid building near the center of town that housed the federal marshal's office. Marshal Robert Carson was a man in his 50s with iron gray hair and shrewd blue eyes. He listened to Teresa's story without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer as she described the murder she had witnessed. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her face. "That is quite an accusation, Miss Bradford," he said finally. "You are claiming that a duly appointed town marshal committed cold-blooded murder." "I am not claiming it," Teresa said steadily, meeting his eyes. "I am testifying to what I saw with my own eyes. Marshal Dalton Hayes shot a man in an alley behind the El Dorado saloon on the night of the 16th. Then he ordered his deputies to dispose of the body. I heard him say they were going to dump it in a ravine past Miller's Creek." "And why should I believe you?" Carson asked, not unkindly. "For all I know, you could be a woman scorned, making up stories to cause trouble for Hayes." "I had never even spoken to Marshal Hayes before that night," Teresa said. "I am a nurse, Marshal Carson. I spent my days tending to sick children and delivering babies and setting broken bones. I have no reason to lie about this, and every reason to want to forget what I saw and go back to my quiet life. But a man was murdered, and his killer needs to face justice." Carson studied her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Parker and Joshua. "You two believe her?" "Absolutely," Parker said without hesitation. "I do," Joshua agreed. "I have only known Miss Bradford a short time, but she strikes me as an honest and forthright woman. More importantly, her story makes sense. We have all heard rumors about Hayes, about how he has his fingers in various illegal enterprises in El Dorado. It is not hard to believe he would kill to protect those interests." Carson drummed his fingers on his desk, clearly thinking. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I will investigate. But I want you to understand, Miss Bradford, that an investigation like this could take weeks or even months. I will need to travel to El Dorado, interview witnesses, search for the body. You will need to stay somewhere safe during that time, and you may eventually need to return to testify formally." "I understand," Teresa said. "I just want the truth to come out." "Fair enough." Carson stood and extended his hand. "I will begin making arrangements immediately. In the meantime, I suggest you stay with the Reynolds family and keep a low profile. If Hayes learns you have contacted federal authorities, he may take desperate action." They left the marshal's office feeling cautiously optimistic. Carson seemed like a man who would follow through on his promises, and having federal authorities involved meant Teresa would have protection Hayes could not easily circumvent. The days that followed fell into a strange sort of peace. Teresa remained at the Reynolds ranch, helping Margaret with household tasks and gradually recovering from the trauma of her ordeal. Parker stayed as well, ostensibly to help with ranch work, but really to be near Teresa. They spent long hours together, riding the property, talking about everything and nothing, slowly building something real between them. One afternoon, about a week after they had spoken to Marshal Carson, Parker invited Teresa to ride out to a small lake on the edge of the ranch property. They sat by the water's edge, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and Teresa felt a contentment she had not known in years. "I could get used to this," she said softly. "What? Sitting by a lake?" Parker asked with a slight smile. "Being with you," Teresa said simply. "Feeling safe and cared for, having someone to talk to who really listens." Parker reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "I could get used to it too," he admitted. "In fact, I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. Does that sound crazy?" "We have only known each other for barely 2 weeks." "It sounds exactly like how I feel," Teresa said. She turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and stolen her heart. "I love you, Parker Reynolds." "I probably should not say it, should wait for you to say it first, or at least wait until our situation is more settled, but I cannot help it. I love you." Parker's face broke into the most beautiful smile Teresa had ever seen. "I love you too," he said. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you running through those streets, terrified but determined to survive. And every moment since then has only made me love you more." He leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Teresa melted into the kiss, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set and stars began to appear overhead. "Marry me," Parker said suddenly, pulling back to look into her eyes. "I know the timing is terrible, and I know we should probably wait, but I do not want to wait. I want you to be my wife, Teresa. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Teresa said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. I would marry you today if we could." Parker laughed, the sound full of joy. "I think Margaret would insist on planning at least a small ceremony, but soon, as soon as this business with Hayes is resolved and you are safe, we will marry." They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, bursting with their news. Margaret cried happy tears and immediately began planning, while Joshua clapped Parker on the back and welcomed Teresa officially into the Reynolds family. 2 weeks later, Marshal Carson returned with news. He had traveled to El Dorado and conducted a thorough investigation. With the help of some of the more honest citizens of the town, he had located the ravine Hayes mentioned and found the body, though it was badly decomposed. More importantly, he had interviewed several people who placed Hayes near the scene of the crime at the right time, and he had found financial records suggesting the murdered man, a land speculator named William Cartwright, had been threatening to expose Hayes's involvement in a fraudulent land scheme. "I have enough to charge Hayes and his deputies with murder," Carson told them. "Warrants have been issued, and I have men bringing them into custody as we speak. You will need to testify at the trial, Miss Bradford, but with the physical evidence and the financial records I have uncovered, your testimony will be the final piece that seals their fate." Teresa felt weak with relief. It was really over. Hayes would face justice and she would be safe. The trial took place 3 months later in Abilene, moved from El Dorado due to concerns about Hayes's influence there. Teresa took the stand and told her story calmly and clearly, describing exactly what she had seen that night. Hayes's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she was mistaken or lying, but the physical evidence and the testimony of other witnesses corroborated her account. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Marshal Dalton Hayes and his 2 deputies were sentenced to hang for the murder of William Cartwright. Justice, delayed but not denied, had been served. 2 days after the trial ended, Parker and Teresa were married in a small ceremony at Joshua and Margaret's ranch. Teresa wore a beautiful white dress that Margaret had made for her, and Parker wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous as he waited for her to walk down the makeshift aisle, Joshua had set up in the front garden. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with Joshua officiating and Margaret standing as witness. When Parker slipped the ring onto Teresa's finger and kissed her as his wife, Teresa felt joy so intense it was almost painful. This man, this wonderful, brave, honorable man, was hers now and she was his, and together they would build a life full of love and meaning. They spent their first night as husband and wife in the guest room that had become Teresa's home over the past months, making love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies and souls. Parker was gentle and patient, making sure Teresa felt safe and cherished, and Teresa gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. "I never thought I would be this happy," Teresa whispered as they lay tangled together afterward, Parker's arms wrapped around her. "After my father died, I thought I would just go through the motions for the rest of my life, doing my work but never really living. You changed all that." "You saved me too," Parker said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I was drifting, never letting myself connect with anyone or anything. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. You gave me a home." They stayed at the ranch through the summer, helping Joshua and Margaret and planning their future. Parker had some money saved from his years of cowboy work, and Teresa had her small inheritance from her father. They decided to buy a piece of land on the far side of Abilene and build a house there, with enough room for Parker to run some cattle and for Teresa to set up a small clinic. "This is cattle country," she said as they stood on the plot of land they had purchased, imagining the house that would stand there. "These people need a nurse, maybe even a full doctor eventually. I could help people again make a difference." "And I will support you in that," Parker said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, I will be right there beside you." They broke ground on the house in September, and by the time the first snow fell in November, they had a snug cabin with 2 rooms and a real fireplace. It was not fancy, but it was theirs, and Teresa had never loved a place more. That winter, as they huddled together against the cold and made plans for the spring, Teresa discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little fear, but mostly joy. They spent long evenings talking to Teresa's growing belly, telling their unborn child about the adventures that had brought their parents together, about the love that had grown from desperate circumstances. Their son was born in early June of 1879, a healthy baby with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination. They named him Samuel, after Teresa's father, and Parker cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by love and responsibility and gratitude. "I will protect him," he whispered to Teresa as she recovered from the birth. "I will protect both of you always. Nothing will ever harm our family." "I know," Teresa said softly, watching her husband cradle their son. "I trust you completely, Parker Reynolds. You have never let me down." The years that followed were full and rich. Teresa opened her clinic and quickly became known throughout the region as a skilled and compassionate healer. Women especially sought her out, grateful to have another woman to care for them during their most vulnerable moments. Parker's cattle operation grew steadily, and he earned a reputation as an honest dealer and a skilled rancher. They had 3 more children in the years that followed: a daughter named Clara, another son named James, and finally another daughter named Sarah, named for Parker's lost sister. Each child was welcomed with joy and raised with love, taught to value honesty and courage and compassion above all else. The story of how their parents met became family legend, told and retold around the dinner table on winter nights. The children never tired of hearing about their mother's bravery and their father's heroism, about the dangerous ride across the prairie and the justice that was ultimately served. Marshal Carson became a friend, stopping by the Reynolds ranch whenever his work brought him to Abilene. He told them that the conviction of Hayes and his deputies had sent shockwaves through law enforcement in Kansas, leading to investigations of other corrupt officials and a general cleanup of several town marshal offices. "You did more than just save yourself," Carson told Teresa on one visit. "You helped clean up an entire system. That takes courage most people do not have." Teresa thought about that conversation often, thought about how one moment of witnessing evil had changed the entire course of her life. If she had not walked past that alley that night, if she had not seen what Hayes did, she would probably still be in El Dorado, living her quiet life, never knowing what she was missing. But she had seen, and she had run, and Parker had saved her, and from that darkness had come light and love and a family she cherished more than anything in the world. 20 years after that fateful night, Teresa and Parker sat on the porch of their now expanded house, watching the sun set over their land. Their children were grown, or nearly so, Samuel preparing to attend university in the East, Clara helping her mother in the clinic, James working the ranch with his father, and Sarah, their youngest at 16, dreaming of becoming a teacher. "You ever regret it?" Parker asked, taking Teresa's hand as they rocked in comfortable silence. "The way our life started, the danger and the fear." Teresa thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "No, not even for a second." "Yes, it was terrifying, and yes, I wish that man had not died and that we could have met under different circumstances. But I cannot regret the path that brought us here, to this life we have built together. You are the love of my life, Parker Reynolds, and I would go through it all again if it meant ending up right here with you." Parker raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the strongest, bravest, most wonderful woman I have ever known. Saving you that night was the best thing I ever did, but you saved me too. You gave me purpose and meaning and a love I never thought I would find." They sat together as the sky darkened and stars appeared. Two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes of fear and violence. Their love had been forged in fire, tested by danger, and proven stronger than any obstacle life could throw at them. And as they walked inside together, hands still clasped, to join their children for dinner, Teresa thought about how justice and love had both been served, how the witness had survived to tell her truth, and how the cowboy who had made sure she lived had become her whole world, her partner, her forever. Their story, born from tragedy and terror, had become one of triumph and devotion, a testament to the power of courage and the strength of love to overcome even the darkest of beginnings. And in the years to come, their children and grandchildren would tell the story again and again, a reminder that heroes come in unexpected forms, that love can bloom in the strangest places, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best things we could ever imagine. The end.